Angus Mitchell, who's a highly distinguished historian, and he's actually in the film that you're going to see after the interval. Yeah, he's been fascinated with Roger Casement for many years, but he didn't start out that way. He went to Brazil. He was interested in the climate and the whole abuse of Aboriginal people and their land, and then he found out that that's what Casement had been interested in, and that's what the film is about. And so I'd ask you to please welcome Angus Mitchell.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you to Marty Malarkey for organising this evening. It was really great corresponding with you over the last few months. I'm actually going to read a paper which I think will take between 30 and 40 minutes, and it was part of a much longer article that I wrote, which in a way, after we'd made the film, I had to explain it to myself. And it is a very complicated kind of convergence of different moments of both photographic and cinematic history. And I suppose this, in a way, is part of the explanation of that convergence. Before I begin, though, I would like to thank my friends in Brazil, our friends in Brazil, in particular, Professor Laura Izara at the University of Sao Paulo, and to Aurélio Michiles, who is the director of the film, and to Patrick Leblanc, who was the producer. So in his great meditation on history and the relationship between remembering and forgetting, the Colombian writer Gabriel García Márquez asks what can be known about any political event. In his novel 100 Years of Solitude, that tension between power, history, and forgetting is evident in a reflection towards the end of the book, which serves, I think, as an epigraph to what I want to talk about. And it's very short, and it's as follows. He says, "One would have thought that he was telling a hallucinated version because it was radically opposed to the false one that historians had created and consequently consecrated in the school books." And this comment by García Márquez speaks to the final section of Seamus Deane's critique of Irish history in his 1997 book, Strange Country, Modernity and Nationhood in Irish Writing since 1790. In considering how colonial regimes of truth are constructed, Deane argued that a nationalist historiography aligns itself with narratives of both myth and apocalypse, hallucinated versions. García Márquez and Deane ask in different ways the same question: where do the limits of history lie? This question confronts us with the immense power of the past, despite its physical absence. If history is recognized as an instrument of forgetting, then memory is less a device of remembrance than a burden to be endlessly renegotiated. The tragic history of extractive rubber is now largely forgotten in the West, yet it caused a social and environmental transformation of the tropical regions of the world of unfathomable scale in terms of inhumanity. For capitalist economies, the boom in latex was intrinsic to the next generation of technological modernity, manifested in electrification, motorized transport, and Fordist mass production. It catalyzed a cataclysmic tension between supply and demand, accompanied by a history of biblical proportions. For Western economies, It was a tale of untrammeled wealth, billowing share prices, fortunes won and lost, and rubber barons ruling over brutal outposts of informal empire. For the people of Africa, the Americas, and Asia, whose ancestral lands and memories were bound to the tropical rainforests that lay in the path of the extractive juggernaut, rubber was synonymous with wide-scale death and destruction. The extractive rubber boom might be framed between the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, enabling rapid access for Britain to India, and the opening of the Panama Canal in 1914, both engineering accomplishments that facilitated commercial movement between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Those two engineering feats accelerated the world economy. Under Western eyes, the history of what happened in the anonymous backlands of the Congo and the Amazon as a result of an insatiable market demand for rubber was eclipsed by the two tragedies that diverted attention towards other paradigms of suffering, and most notably the First World War and the Spanish influenza pandemic. Despite the tide of outrage before 1914, after the Versailles Settlement of 1919, the rubber atrocities were accepted as part of the collateral damage of modernization. Moreover, the trajectory of the principal official witness to these atrocities, Roger Casement, added to the complexity of the tragedy in terms of its acceptance as history. As a colonial officer arriving into Africa in the early 1880s, Casement was part of the white advance party that invaded the interior of Africa. His 20 years' involvement with sub-Saharan Africa ended with his damning denouncement of European colonialism and his covert role co-founding the Congo Reform Association, which of course happens in County Down in the Slieve Donard Hotel, and a deepening commitment to Irish cultural nationalism as an antidote to imperial overreach and the political failures of the Home Rule crisis. In 1910, by then Consul General in Brazil, Casement described in detail his voyage through the forests and liquid landscape of the Amazon into the Putumayo. In 1911, he was knighted for his services to the British Empire, which of course he was reluctant to accept, but felt that it would really deny him the power he needed to move the campaign that much further down the road. And 5 years later, he was arrested running guns into Ireland to arm the Irish volunteers and quickly executed in central London for high treason. Questions about how Casement's experiences within the contact zones of empire came to shape his anti-imperialism inevitably prompt awkward responses. Disgraced and humiliated within the annals of the British Empire, the witness and whistleblower Casement was banished to a dimension of fugitive history, where both his presence and absence were destined to rupture the infallibility of the National Archive and to haunt the liberal belief in the grand narrative of progress. There is a predisposition among those who depend on forgetting to cover up their crimes that time is on their side. Omnia tendunt naturaliter in non esse is an old Latin adage which translates roughly as all things tend naturally towards non-existence. But this truism seems not to apply in the case of the extractive rubber industry and the resource wars that it brought. If in those years before 1914, the atrocities resulting from Putumayo red rubber became the most forensically examined incident of the apocalyptic tragedy of both the Congo and Amazon rubber booms, after 1919, the knowledge of this tragedy was buried inside a labyrinth of interdependent and entangled bureaucracy and secrets. For the rest of the 20th century, the atrocities remained in a liminal space, rearing up from within the realm of subjugated regimes of epistemology. Leslie Wiley opens her cultural history of the Putumayo with a quote, "Everything about that region, the Putumayo, is immense, beginning with our ignorance about it." What Wiley and others have shown is that both the Putumayo and the Northwest Amazon was a region with a unique and intricate knowledge of plant systems. Ethnobotanists, plant hunters, and medical anthropologists ascribed to the shamanic dimension an astonishing insight into medicinal plants and an advanced philosophy of knowledge constituted by healing and magic. A stream of travel books attested to this uniquely complex and advanced world. Nicole Maxwell's 1961 book, Witch Doctor's Apprentice, Hunting for Medicinal Plants in the Amazon. The botanical voyages of Harvard University's Richard Evans Schultes opened eyes to new dimensions of consciousness, and his life is magisterially described by Wade Davis in One River, Explorations and Discoveries in the Amazon Rainforest. And then, of course, in Shamanism, Colonialism, and the Wild Man, a study in terror and healing, the medical anthropologist Michael Taussig considered how shamanic healing practices confronted the remnants of the space of terror caused by rubber extraction. More recently, the moment has been accessed through consideration of the vision painting of shamanic artists and their insights into the continuing legacy of intergenerational trauma. Extractive rubber left a deep legacy of psychological suffering. Fieldwork by the Colombian anthropologist Juan Álvaro Echeverri has argued how the survivors of this Holocaust banished the memories of evil into the basket of darkness. But there is no simple matrix of memory for comprehending the Putumayo atrocities. Colonial power relations enslaved locals to become both victims and perpetrators in a system of extraction that worked solely for the benefit of the market. This rush for rubber extraction was borne out along two dimensions, one that was identifiably national and another that was driven by extractive capitalist expansion and the search for new markets. In the late 19th century, Brazil, Colombia, and Peru recognized the economic value of deforested frontiers in terms of both national and international aggrandizement. This triggered diplomatic, military, commercial, and legal strategies to occupy and control what was designated to the imperial mind as unceded land, terra nullius, or unclaimed territory, a principle that entirely ignored the presence of the communities living within the forests. A key instrument of the technology of conquest was photography. The argument of Ariela Aisha Azoulay is useful here to theorize the underlying value of the image to the imperial right to destroy. Azoulay argues how the camera shutter was used to dissect communities, people, and objects and turn them into standardized data. From 1492, empires assumed imperial rights to appropriate, record, measure, differentiate, and exhibit. In the escalation and expansion of empires in the late 19th century, the adaptation of this technology was even more devastating. The camera and the image became frontline technologies of suppression, defending imperial logic and the sense of historical progress, while disallowing the violence from breaking through into the popular consciousness of the metropole. Description, in terms of both text and photography, became part of the toolkit of invasion and occupation of new territories. Julio César Arana, the rubber baron responsible for strategically dominating the Putumayo, was all too conscious of the importance of optics in his strategy to control his commercial operations. The war for commerce and civilization became a war of propaganda and public relations. Over time, that was transferred into a struggle between history and counter-histories. Because the territory of the Putumayo was so evidently disputed and remote from any legal regulation, there the confrontation proved particularly vicious. Early in the 20th century, cinemas and photographic studios became part of the cultural and commercial landscape of the Amazon. The three main cities spanning the river, Belém, Manaus, and Iquitos, all had commercial cinemas. The Spanish photographer Manuel Rodriguez Lira set up a studio and laboratory in Iquitos in 1899. Photography and moving pictures were intrinsic to the march of Amazonian modernity. In the Putumayo, the disappearance and death of a French photographer, Eugenio Robuchon, triggered the socialist Benjamin Saldanha Rocha to establish his anti-Arana newspaper, La Felpa and La Sanción. And one of the pioneers of Brazilian cinema, whose moving pictures you'll see in Aurélio's film, Silvino Santos, was funded by Arana to go to Paris to the studios run by the Lumiere brothers to learn about cinema so that he could make films demonstrating the achievements of Arana's civilizing mission. So one of the pioneering moments of world cinema is indelibly embroiled with the expansion of South American republics into the Amazon. And that is an important part of this film which wouldn't be necessarily understood or recognized unless you were told about it. But in a funny way, this film is the story about the birth of cinema in South America. And that the films on the Putumayo were really some of the earliest films produced there. Simultaneously, the new frontiers of South America were part of the defining of a new age in the Atlantic economy and extractive capitalism. From the mid-19th century, European shipping companies opened direct lines with Belém, Manaus, and Iquitos. The assertion of an ethnographic paradigm and typology and the need to define and classify the native peoples in words and images was constitutive in essentializing the sentiment of difference between civilized and savage for both the nation and this globalizing economy. Recent work, notably that of Mark Seeley, has shown how Western photographic practice created Eurocentric and what he calls violent visual regimes to support racist ideologies. And you'll see right at the start, after the very powerful footage by Marc Allégret, who traveled with the French writer André Gide into the Congo in the 1920s. After that initial footage, you cut to the very violent regimes or visual violent regimes of the Congo Reform Association. In the late 19th century, this had resonances in the social surveying and evidence gathering underpinning the work of Charles Booth's investigation of the London poor. Profits of the Booth Steamship Company that financed the building of harbours in Manaus and Iquitos and played such a critical part in the commercial expansion of the Amazon were channeled into the founding of British social sciences. And this again is an extraordinary irony that the Unitarian Booth family from Liverpool, who had this very profitable and efficiently run passenger steamship line running from Liverpool to the Amazon, and were essentially exporting huge amounts of stuff, extraction coming back into the British market. Charles Booth then undertook this famous mapping of the poor of London, which is now a bigger part of the LSE archive, and a lot of very early British socialist intellectuals, including Beatrice Webb, were involved in gathering that data. As proof of their modernity and civilized status, the jungle-girt cities of Belém and Manaus produced lavish publications, reproducing pictures of avenues of streets elegantly defined by mango trees, tramcar lines, and imposing civic architecture. Such books were often supplemented with fold-out illustrations and maps. European publishers found a ready market for such publications on South American travel. But the confident advance of tropical modernity, built on the blood, sweat, and tears of rubber extraction, began to unravel with the increased circulation of rumors about empires of slavery and violence. The camera was diverted away from the documentation of the exotic and the march of progress, and utilized instead in providing proof for evolving humanitarian campaigns. In the Putumayo Valley, national and commercial interests turned the disputed territory into a particularly violent space. And then for a brief period from 1909 to 1913, the Putumayo atrocities made headlines around the world. But this immeasurable crime against humanity was gradually shut down by willful acts of amnesia, the screening out of violence, the imposition of silences, the sanitizing of the archive, and the building of consoling mythologies and histories, scaffolding an architecture of forgetting. The Colombian anthropologist Margarita Serge has recently noted how, quote, the case of the Putumayo has been rendered invisible in the history of the rubber industry. Now, with Secrets from Putumayo, Aurélio Michiles has reconditioned the archive so as to summon a reading that speaks to contemporary debates on racism, decolonization, tropical ecology, and the tension between remembering and forgetting. Through the recovery of archival images interlaced with flashes of spectral effect and interviews with descendants of survivors, Secrets from Putumayo recasts the story of the journey of Roger Casement into the Northwest Amazon in 1910. And of course, Stephen is the voice of Casement. The logic of Casement's awakening into anti-colonial activism erupts out of the fusion of his experience witnessing the colonial encounter in the Congo and Amazon with his historic understanding of Ireland's struggle for self-determination. So you get that fusion of his own historic relationship to Ireland with what he's witnessing in the Amazon. You'll see how that happens. The historic plight of Ireland, evident in the penal laws, the tragedy of the famine, forced evictions, land wars, and the low-level resistance to the rule of the English landlord, is brought inside the frame. Ireland's long struggle is woven into the upriver journey. These complementary cartographies of colonialism are overlaid and merge into a common struggle. When Casement resigned from the British Foreign Office, he involved himself in a campaign in Connemara and referred to an Irish Putumayo and the white Indians of Connemara. So Roger Casement's archive of images from his 1910 Amazon voyage can be interpreted as a counter-narrative intended to destabilize the colonial gaze and encourage a different form of empathetic engagement. It becomes, I would argue, to use the word of Ariella Aisha Azoulay, a way of unlearning imperialism. Casement shot 17 rolls of film during his time in the Putumayo in 1910. He also took a camera with him on his return voyage up the river in 1911. During that initial trip, 3 of the other commissioners who traveled with him also took cameras. And from references in subsequent correspondence, the photographs taken by the commissioners were circulated, swapped, reproduced in different formats, and assembled by Casement into albums to complement, or supplement rather, his text and serve as visual evidence and material proof. Casement sent copies to the Anti-Slavery and Aborigines Protection Society and international press outlets, including the Illustrated London News. The value Casement placed on the image as integral to his investigation is evident from a recently discovered album of his photographs that are all reproduced in the film. This selection of images, and that archive was found in the Library of Congress, and which in the State Department archive. This selection of images, principally pertaining to his 1910 journey, amounts to an executive summary and the storyboarding of his investigation into an easily digestible format for busy State Department officials. By placing the images alongside brief descriptive captions, deeper meanings and contexts can be decoded. Although the document is titled Photographs of Putumayo Indians, Casement was careful to differentiate the names of the identifiable tribes and language groups in that region. Even though the images are often unfocused and of poor quality and have the feeling of spontaneity and lack of technical understanding, they are clearly integral to the broader dossier of forensic reporting and witnessing. They provide a critical insight into the physical conditions of the Putumayo Indians and the ambience of the commercial world under investigation. It should be remembered that Casement was suffering for most of his Putumayo trip in 1910 from a desperate eye infection, and this was particularly bad in the first 4 weeks of his journey. The motivating challenge of his investigation was to provide proof of crimes, proof with moral authority. And early on, he had great difficulty in getting the other commissioners to see what he was seeing. They seemed averse to acknowledge the evidence of criminality that, in Casement's view, was in plain sight. He recognized that there were different ways of seeing. His sense of frustration builds to that moment of lucidity when he quotes, and I quote from his journal here, he says, "This thing we find here is carrion, a pestilence, a crime against humanity. And the man who defends it is, consciously or unconsciously, putting himself on the side of the lowest scale of humanity and propagating a moral disease that religion and conscience and all that is upright in us should uncompromisingly denounce." So the overarching structure of Casement's investigation was recorded in this bulky journal, which is the thing I gave to Aurélio back in 1997 when I published it based on my work and on the manuscript, which is held in the National Library of Ireland. It covers about a 75-day period from the 23rd of September to the 6th of December and is supplemented by lengthy testimonies he transcribed in longhand from his interviews with the Barbadian overseers who had been imported into the area to essentially do much of the kind of heavy-handed work for the company. In this narrative, Casement provides analytical context to what he is witnessing. He places the Indian at the very core of his interrogation of the extractive system. He uses the lens to recognize different versions of proof and reality as he maps the cartography of colonial violence. And what is apparent from his journal is that he was acutely attentive as an observer. He's a remarkably sensitive observer of the crimes that are being committed. The body of the Indian becomes a critical evidential source in revealing long histories of oppression. He breaks through the descriptive strictures of the physical anthropologist to read the bodies and faces as sources of evidence for understanding the emotional, philosophical, and moral qualities of the victims and how their scars, physiques, and expressions of suffering expose the system nourishing the space of terror. Casement is conscious of the proof value of the image as part of the moral arsenal of his investigation. He recognized that the imperial ordering of the world had conditioned people to deny alternative possibilities of reality. He reflects at one point, and I quote, "Of course, there are lots of people in the world who will defend anything that exists merely because it exists. And they are so mentally constructed that they cannot imagine another state of things." Casement's questioning of the system constructs another way of imagining and breaking through the realism imposed by colonial capitalism. He is in search of new representational mediums capable of confronting and upending the dominant racial boundaries. His images capture the returning gaze of the colonized native and the sense of human vulnerability. Victims become real persons. Some are named, some are even claimed as friends. He recounts the stories of those who had resisted. The tapestry of violence maintaining the system is described. Scars of the lash, mental health problems, the denigration and sexual abuse of women, child labor, starvation as a form of control, oppressive economic regulation and debt, haunted and terrified expressions, the death sentence imposed by the regime, the false displays of joy evident in the dances, distended stomachs, terrified glances, and a sense of melancholic homelessness and dispossession. He refers to how the Putumayo Indians were being, quote, systematically starved and systematically raided. On another level, there are more abstract forms of violence sustained by strategies of silence and epistemological misrepresentation. In some images, Indians appear like ghosts. Elsewhere, he defines their sense of dignity and agency. His evidence scaffolds pathways into seeing deeper, hidden truths concealed beneath the veneer of civilization and company policy. Carolina Sá Carvalho has argued that these images provide insight into how Casement was experimenting with new ways of seeing the indigenous body in terms of both its agency and as a site of violation. She shows that understanding the tragedy and the ability to see the scars requires, quote, a perspective determined by past experiences and affective disposition. In other words, the scars are only apparent to those who identify with and understand histories of oppression. Casement was struggling with his own subjectivity, his relationship between self and other, between his official brief as an investigator and commissioner, with his deepening empathy for the oppressed as he draws transhistorical comparisons with the Irish situation. Paradoxically, he comes to embody both the imperialist and the anti-imperialist, and his journey becomes that moment, that critical moment of metamorphosis. The Putumayo would be Casement's last official stand. His achievement was to historicize a narrative of trans-temporal and trans-spatial oppression through structuring an alternative reality where the violence committed against the African, the Native American, and the Irish language speaker becomes a shared and interconnected violence. A key instrument of colonization is the denial of historical agency to those whose lands are being usurped through brutality, Those who challenge empire become people without history, and in that process are often erased from sight. A question that has arisen in recent debates about decolonization is who counts as human? You need rights to have rights. Casement's investigation of colonial power relations interrogated the politics of representation. Who had the right to representation, and to what forms of representation? In the Putumayo, he was cross-examining the underlying structures of colonial representation to persuade his audience in Whitehall and Washington that not only were the natives not different from us, but they were, in fact, morally superior. To do that, he asked the viewer, you, to look and to acknowledge the vulnerability of their humanity, to recognize their suffering and to affirm their dignity. He gave visibility to the indigenous communities undergoing a process of violent invasion of their land and culture. This posed a direct challenge to how the white world wishes to see the realism upholding the illusion and notions of civilization. Through the fusion of text and images and the extensive archive deriving from Casement's official career, he upturned and dismantled colonial hierarchy by positioning the Putumayo Indian at the apex of the moral order of the Amazon. The criminal white-collar white man, morally degraded and dependent upon vice and deception to support his world system, is relegated to the bottom. And in that interrogation of the social structure of the extractive economy, moral character was the key indicator of humanity and civility, and in his mind, moral authority lay unequivocally with the indigenous other. Casement's dilemma was always one of communication, how to articulate to as great an audience as possible the scale of the tragedy that he had witnessed and the urgency of stopping the blind destruction of humanity and environment. He brought an anti-colonial dimension to the intellectual framework of the 1916 Easter Rising that modern history refuses to acknowledge as legitimate. Through diagnosing what Priya Satya describes as history's complicity in empire, Michiles reinstates a perspective of that extractive economy that explains its cost in terms of global, social, and ecological sacrifice. By reassembling a different register of time, Secrets from Putumayo becomes a counter-history, Seamus Deane's moment of apocalypse, aimed to breach the walls of putrid historical orthodoxy through using cinema's language of poetic knowledge and truth. The overlapping choruses of imperial evidence in terms of photographs and testimony are reconstituted to assist in the task of unlearning imperialism. The viewer is left with what Ariela Aisha Azoulay defines as a fundamental pillar of what she terms potential history, the transformation of violence into shared care for our common world.